There is a kind of man who wakes up every morning already exhausted, not from the night before, not from the work that waits for him, but from the weight of a life he never chose and never had the courage to refuse. He checks his phone before he opens his eyes. He scrolls through other people's victories while his coffee gets cold. He nods when he means no. He smiles when he means nothing. He has learned, with terrifying precision, how to disappear inside his own skin while still showing up, all still punching the clock, still saying the right things at the right moments to the right people who will forget him by Tuesday. If you have ever felt that specific kind of tiredness, the one that sleep cannot fix, the one that follows you into the weekend and sits across from you at dinner and never says a word, but never leaves either, then this video was made for you. Not for the man who has it figured out. Not for the one with the morning routine and the gratitude journal and the 5-year plan laminated on his refrigerator. For the one who suspects, somewhere deep in the part of himself he does not show anyone, that something went wrong a long time ago, and that most of what he does every day is just an elaborate way of not thinking about it. Charles Bukowski spent most of his life being exactly the kind of man the world told him he should be ashamed of. He drank too much. He worked terrible jobs for terrible wages. He was ugly by conventional standards, difficult by any standard, and he failed at nearly everything society told him mattered before he succeeded at the one thing he chose for himself. And from that position, from the bottom of the pile, from the edge of the bar stool, from the back of the post office sorting room at 2 in the morning, he saw something most men never see because they are too busy trying to climb to ever stop and look around. He saw what weakness actually looks like. Not the weakness of poverty or failure or addiction. The deeper weakness, the kind that wears a tie, the kind that gets promoted, the kind that calls itself responsible and mature and realistic, while slowly rotting from the inside with everything it swallowed and never said. What Bukowski identified in his poems, his novels, his letters, his entire life lived as a provocation against comfort. Was that the most dangerous form of weakness in a man is not the inability to fight or to earn or to endure hardship. It is the inability to be honest. Honest with the world, yes, but first and most devastatingly, honest with himself. The weak man Bukowski wrote about is not the one lying in the gutter, or it is the one who has built a perfectly acceptable life around a perfectly hollow center, and who protects that hollowness with so much routine and obligation and distraction that he has forgotten it is there at all. That man is everywhere. That man might be you. And if part of you flinched just now at that sentence, it is worth asking why. The first thing weak men cannot stop doing is seeking approval from people who do not matter and would not notice if they disappeared. As Bukowski wrote about this impulse with the kind of contempt that only comes from someone who recognized it in himself and burned it out. The need for approval is not innocent. It is not humility. It is a form of self-abandonment dressed up as social grace. Every time a man edits himself before he speaks, not for kindness, not for clarity, but because he is afraid of what someone might think, he chips away at the thing that makes him real. Bukowski understood that a man who is always performing for an audience eventually forgets who he is when the audience leaves. And the tragedy is that the audience always leaves, the applause always stops. And what is left is a man standing in an empty room, not knowing what he actually believes, what he actually wants, what he actually is, because he spent so long being whatever the room needed him to be. The second thing weak men cannot stop doing is confusing comfort with safety. There is a particular kind of man who has arranged his entire existence around the avoidance of discomfort. He stays in the job he hates because the alternative is uncertainty. He stays in the relationship that suffocates him because the alternative is loneliness. He stays in the city, the habit, the routine, the version of himself that stopped growing at 26 because every other direction feels like falling. Bukowski lived the opposite of this and paid every price for it. He was broke, being sick, alone, rejected by publishers for years, laughed at, dismissed, and he kept writing. Not because he was brave in the Hollywood sense, but because he understood that the comfort men run toward is often just a slower and more decorated form of the death they are running from. Real safety, the kind that does not crack under pressure, does not come from removing all risk. It comes from knowing you can survive the things you are afraid of, and the only way to know that is to stop hiding from them. The third thing is one of the most common and least examined habits in modern men, and it is the habit of lying about what they feel. Not in dramatic ways, not in ways that anyone would call lying. Just the constant low-level suppression of everything real. The man who says he is fine when he is not. The man who says it does not bother him when it does. The man who has learned to translate every vulnerable thing he feels into something more acceptable, more controlled, more masculine in the way that masculinity has been sold to him since childhood, which is to say, less human. Bukowski's work is full of men who feel everything and have nowhere to put it. Men who drink because the feeling has to go somewhere, and the bar is the only place that does not ask them to explain it. There is no romance in that. Bukowski never romanticized it, but he saw it clearly for what it was. Men suffocating inside their own silence, not because they were strong, but because they had been taught that expression was weakness and had believed it long enough to make it true. Before we go further, there is something important to say, and it needs to be said directly. If you are watching this video, if you have made it this far, there is a good chance you recognize something in what you are hearing, not as theory, as life, as something you have carried without a name for it. And if that is true, if any of this is landing somewhere real inside you, I want you to go to the comments right now and write something. It does not have to be long. You can copy and paste this exact sentence if you want. I have been tired of pretending for a long time. That is it. You do not have to explain yourself. You do not have to tell your whole story. Just put it there. Because every man who reads that in the comments and recognizes himself in it will feel for one moment slightly less alone. And that is not nothing. That is actually everything. The fourth thing weak men cannot stop doing is waiting. Waiting to feel ready. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for permission from a life that was never going to give it. Bukowski did not wait. He wrote on napkins. He wrote on paper bags. He wrote at the kitchen table at 4 in the morning after a double shift. He wrote bad things and kept writing until he wrote true things. He was not waiting for inspiration. He was not waiting for someone to tell him his work mattered. He had heard for years that it did not, that he was nothing, that his voice was too rough and his subjects too low, and his language too honest for anyone to want it. And he wrote anyway, because the waiting is itself a form of cowardice. It feels like patience. It feels like preparation. It feels responsible. But underneath it, better if you are honest, it is fear with better posture. The man who is always getting ready to live his life is already living one, just not the one he would have chosen if he had stopped waiting long enough to choose. The fifth thing is perhaps the hardest one to say, and Bukowski said it his entire life without ever making it easy to hear, and it is this. Weak men cannot stop outsourcing their meaning. They wait for work to give them purpose, for a relationship to make them whole for some external structure, a role, a title, a community, an ideology, to tell them who they are and whether it matters. And when those structures fail, as they always eventually do, they fall apart in proportion to how much they depended on them. Bukowski refused every structure that did not come from inside. He refused the literary establishment. He refused bourgeois comfort. He refused the version of love that asked him to perform rather than feel. Not because he was better than those things, but because he understood that a man who borrows his meaning from the world will always be one cancellation, one layoff, one breakup away from having nothing. And nothing, for that kind of man, is not just emptiness, it is annihilation. What Bukowski left behind is not a philosophy you can follow like a program. It is not a set of steps, it is a mirror. And the mirror is unflattering. It shows you the approval-seeking you call politeness, the paralysis you call caution, the numbness you call stability, the silence you call strength. But it also shows you something else. It shows you that the men who have lived closest to the truth of themselves, not the cleaned-up version, not the marketable version, but the raw and difficult and unedited truth, those men carry something that no amount of performance can replicate. They carry the specific weight of a life that was actually lived. That's Bukowski was not a happy man in the way that word gets used on motivational posters, but he was a real one. And in a world that manufactures endless versions of the acceptable and the aspirational and the optimized, being real has become the rarest and most radical thing a person can be. If this video reached something in you that most things do not reach, if it touched the part of you that has been waiting for someone to say the true thing instead of the comfortable thing, then do something small but real right now. Hit the like button, not as a reflex, but because it tells whatever is listening in the algorithm that this kind of conversation deserves to exist, that honesty deserves to travel farther than performance, and that the men sitting alone somewhere at midnight who need to hear this should be able to find it. And if you want more of this, if you want a place that keeps coming back to the hard questions without flinching, buy it without selling you a better version of the same comfortable lie, then subscribe to this channel. Every video here is made for the person who is done pretending, for the man who is tired of the performance and ready to look at himself without apology. You do not have to have it figured out. You do not have to be anywhere other than exactly where you are. You just have to be willing to be honest. Bukowski built his entire life on that one thing, and it turned out to be enough.